Good Yontiv, everyone. Good Yontiv. Shana Tova, Tikatevu, a sweet and a healthy new year of being inscribed in a book that's worth reading. I don't want to be inscribed in any book, and I don't want you inscribed in any book. I want our lives to be lives that are worth living, that have meaning and purpose and love and light and art and music and justice and peace and color. So did you pay attention to this reading, Torah reading, as I asked? That wasn't very... All right, so let's look at this Torah reading a little bit. And I know there are folks in our overflow service. Hello, everybody, and hello, live stream. If you're with us, we're going to look at the Torah reading for this morning, which is on page 492 of our Machzor. And if you're at home and you just have a Chumash, we're at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 5 to start with. But as I mentioned earlier, in my first half of the Drashah, conveniently done while we were rolling the Torah, this Parsha is really the inspiration for the TV show Handmaid's Tale. This is where we get the description of a legal wife who can't give birth, and she takes a slave, a concubine who is a slave woman, and gives that woman to the husband to have sex with, to rape, and then to give birth to children who will then technically belong to the legal wife. That's the story we're reading on this Holy of Days, beginning the Jewish New Year. And not only that, but the legal wife, Sarah, who has wealth and power, is quite cruel and jealous. Even though she has money and power and wealth, she is ultimately extremely jealous of this young woman who is an enslaved woman, but who can give birth. And the jealousy overwhelms her. When we study this text, the first thing that we're asking of ourselves is, which character do we identify with? How do we relate to these people who are our holy ancestors? We pray about our matriarchs and patriarchs. This is the story of their relationship. Who do you relate to? Who do you find a connection to? Some people are quick to say that Hagar, the oppressed one, is the one with whom they feel the most immediate connection. And in fact, the black feminist or womanist theologians have taken Hagar as the representation of black or women of color everywhere and how they are treated by a white supremacist society. And throughout black theology, black womanist theology, Hagar is held up as the representation of women of color everywhere. It's hard, of course, to relate to Sarah, who uses her power in such evil ways, one could say. She casts out Hagar. Although she puts Hagar in the position to begin with, she then casts out. And some would say that Avraham himself, how do we relate to this ancestor of our ancestors who plays an extremely passive role in allowing some terrible things to happen? There are others who say, well, you know what, these three characters, in a very Jungian way, are really representing parts of ourselves. And it's not about one or the other, but the truth is there's a little bit of all three inside of us. This itself could take days and days and days to unpack, or maybe lifetimes. But one way to read the text to begin with is to try and see which parts of ourselves are in all three of these characters. Hagar, the one who is really a victim. Sarah, who has power and uses it, sometimes with great pain towards others. And Avraham, who has power, and is quite silent and passive. In what ways do we find ourselves in all three of the characters? It's too simple to say, I think, that there's only one who is us. Maybe all are us on some level. And then there's the boys, the two children who are the subject of our stories today and tomorrow. Yishmael, the son of Hagar, and Yitzchak, the son of Sarah, both with the same father. What a complicated family story. Oy, Gavalt. And in this story, again, we come back on this such a holy day. We read of a family in such crisis and dysfunction, if we could use a contemporary word to read back these biblical stories. And yet, let's look a little bit more at Hagar. For those Hebrew speakers who are here today, how would you translate if you just saw these letters? Hey, Gimel, Resh. Yeah, the stranger. The Gimel Resh is the Hebrew word for ger, for stranger. Hagar literally is the stranger. The word ger is used in our text throughout the Chumash. In 36 times we're told, so famously lifted up, remember the stranger, because for once you were strangers, and therefore, and the sentences change, don't oppress the widow, or the vulnerable, or the poor. You were a stranger, so remember those who are enslaved peoples now, over and over again. So maybe the text, when it says remember the stranger, is also reminding us to remember Hagar herself as the first stranger. And how does then Hagar's life happen? If you look at the simple telling of the story, she has to leave her home. She is thrown out of her home. One, because of domestic violence. Well, that sounds pretty familiar. Two, because her own home becomes a place of such violence, she has to flee and go into the desert with nothing but a little satchel of food that Abraham manages to give her before sending her into the desert. He does the only thing he thinks he can do. He can't stop her exile. For some reason, he doesn't think he has the power to stand up to Sarah's edict. And he witnesses her being sent into the desert with a boy, a child, completely weak and vulnerable, with a little bit of food, knowing, assuming that sure death will take place, but it will be outside of his view. He won't see it. He's given them enough food and sent them away. He won't see their death, but if he were to be awake and to really think about the consequences of his actions, he knew, he must have known, it would be death. Who is at fault? Sarah, who sent them away? Abraham, who silently participated? Remember the stranger, because you were strangers. This story has troubled our rabbinic storytellers for generations. It's such a difficult story. Some of the rabbis work very hard to find ways to justify what Sarah does and to show ways that Yishmael was evil or a bad influence on Yitzchak and therefore deserved to be banished. But not all of the rabbinic interpreters of these stories go there. Ramban, or Nachmanides, a very famous medieval Spanish commentator, he was very upset about this story. And he said the fault in this story belongs to Abraham. Now that takes a tremendous amount for somebody to say that Abraham, who is the ancestor of our ancestors, the one whose name we invoke, is the one who is at fault in these stories because he stood idly by, Nachmanides says, and watched this young woman with a defenseless child be sent into the desert. The real problem maybe is Abraham. Maybe not Sarah. Maybe she is also a victim of her complicated position as a woman. But as I said before, I think all three on some level represent all of us. Some of you might know the great Rembrandt painting which hangs at the Met and is one of my favorites, which is his painting called The Dismissal of Hagar. It is such a powerful painting. He chose not to paint Sarah and Avraham as a lovely family unit, but rather the dismissal of Hagar. And there is Avraham in his resplendent clothes of wealth and power, and Hagar being sent off into the desert. It's a profound, profound commentary on the story. In 1933, when Hitler moved from being in the appointed position he was appointed in early 1933 to his position, and then in March and April of 33, there were elections in which he was actually elected to his position. Between his appointment and his election, the German Jewish community really struggled to understand what was happening and who this person was. A famous editorial was published in this period saying, "We shouldn't worry so much about Hitler because his ideas are so wacky that when he gets into power, there is no way he will be able to enact these ideas. Those around him," they said in this editorial, "will control him. Those around him will make sure that these ideas, which are so antithetical to our German culture and to our German society, will make sure that they aren't actually enacted. And maybe even when he's in power, he will learn that to be the head of a government requires wisdom and restraint. And these ideas which catapulted him into popular position will be limited by the truth and responsibility of actually running a government." And some even argued that in those elections that were held in the spring of 33, that Jews should even vote for Hitler in order to show loyalty, and that if the German government understood how loyal Jews would be, that there would be less likelihood that these ideas, which he was very public about, would not be enacted. Now, those ideas, by the way, did not include genocide at that time, but they were extremely anti-Jewish, and they were very virulent in what he thought of immigrants in particular, and refugees who were coming into Germany from Poland and some of the surrounding Slavic or nearby Slavic countries. Of course, when I say those things now, what's our reaction? But sure sounds familiar. Hannah Arendt, who is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, was, of course, a refugee. She said in her famous essay, "In the first place, we don't like to be called refugees," she wrote in 1943. She was actually in New York by then. A decade previously, so in 1933, she fled her native Germany without papers. After years in Paris as an undocumented immigrant, or in other words, an illegal, she was sent with other Jews to an internment camp. She escaped from that camp and made it to Portugal and then to the United States. But in 1943, she was still stateless. And in her indispensable essay, which is called "We Refugees," she tries, and I quote from Jason Farago, she tried to fathom her place in a flood of displaced innocence, so traumatic that even those fleeing would rather not talk about it. Hell is no longer a religious belief or a fantasy, but is something as real as houses and stones and trees, Arendt wrote. Apparently, nobody wants to know that contemporary history has created a new kind of human being, the kind that are put into concentration camps by their foes and internment camps by their friends. In today's world, there are 25.9 refugees worldwide. The highest million, what did I say? 25.9, sorry, 25.9 million, yes. Thank you. I always appreciate corrections. Don't hesitate. It's the highest number since World War II. A huge portion of that number are children. It is possible, we all know, to become overwhelmed by this. Every single one of them has a right to asylum, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Few, of course, are finding it. The United States, which has led the world in welcoming asylum seekers, as we heard, the gates are shutting. This past week, the current regime announced that refugees, not asylum seekers, but the number of refugees allowed into this country is going to be limited this year to 18,000. And that's after many in the government argued it should be 0. And that's down from about 85,000 or 100,000. I talk about immigrants a lot. And this Torah portion says it really clearly. Hagar, the stranger, is one of us. 36 times we're told. And I tell this history lesson over and over and over again because it cannot be told enough. In 1924, the gates were shut here in the United States to Jews from Eastern Europe and all Southern European peoples. 1924. They were shut specifically because there was racism against Jews from Eastern Europe and Italians. Make no mistake about it. Those two groups were the object of the immigration quotas of 1924. How many people in this room, and I ask this over and over again, have relatives who came to the United States before 1924? How many people in this room have relatives, or you yourselves, came to the United States after 1924? A very different number. A very different number. 75% to 80% of all Jews in the United States are descendants now of people who came to the United States before 1924. It's true of my family, who came before 1924, and those who did not come before 1924 were slaughtered in Europe between 1933, when Hitler came to power, and 1945, when Hitler was defeated. Period. The story is a simple one. When people say, but let's let people come in legally, like our families came in, and then we can talk about immigration in America. Let us be clear about that. If anybody hears that or says that, of course there should be immigration reform. Of course there are reasons there should be borders. Of course there should be a sensible process by which people can be welcomed into this country. But let us be clear that before 1924, none of our families who came into this country came in with any necessary paperwork. It wasn't required. My grandmother, who came in 1912 through the New York port, did not speak English, did not have any talents that the government would respect, had no degrees, did not go to school, had no college, high school or college education. She could not have gotten into the United States today. That is true of most of your relatives. And we, as the Jewish community, including Stephen Miller, needs to understand that. We are here, and again, there's a lot of room for debate about what our immigration policies should be, but not a single Jew has the right to argue that our families came in here legally, therefore we need to throw out illegals who are here now, or undocumented who are here now. We do not have that right because we are Hagar. We are the ones who fled from Europe long before there was a Hitler in many of our cases, because the conditions of anti-Jewish oppression were so severe. We fled. And this country had open gates. This cannot be talked about enough. We cannot be Sarah to send people out, and we cannot be Avraham to be silent and to pretend we did our best. We gave a little peckle of some a little food to send them into the desert. We have to be extremely engaged, or we threaten to blacken the memory of our ancestors who made it here so that we could be alive. So the Jewish community is very engaged, but there are those within the Jewish community who argue the following. This is about legal versus illegal, and if they're coming in here illegally, they shouldn't be allowed. Our families came in here legally, which is true for some, but most of us came in and the only requirement was not to be sick and to be checked for typhoid or for tuberculosis and not to have a criminal record that they could find. Last night, I said, it's not enough to yell at our TV sets or to post things on Facebook. It's simply not enough. I'm going to say this as clearly as I can. The house is burning. The house is burning. We are at a moment in time where our souls are being called to account. And on Rosh Hashanah, we have to look back on the year which has passed, and each of us has to examine our lives in the most personal ways, our own personal relationships, our own care for our bodies, our care for our loved ones, our care for our world, and we have to ask ourselves, can we say that each of us has done all we can to live up to what our ancestors did in order for us to be alive to honor their memory? Have we done enough? Now, we've read the stories of what's going on in the border, where there are, whether you call them internment camps or concentration camps, they are camps in which people are being held, human beings, children, thousands and thousands and thousands of children are being held in subhuman conditions with our tax dollar. We've heard those stories, and we can't imagine what we can possibly do besides really focusing on changing the regime which is now in charge of this country. And that is essential. That remains an essential aspect of what this coming year must be for everybody's life, is to focus on creating policies and leaders in this country which will change what these acts are. But in the meantime, or maybe I should say, that's not enough. We got ourselves into this position, and it wasn't because one particular person was just elected to office. That's too easy. We're all a little Avrahami in this story. We all thought it was enough to live our lives with a little decency, and that would become enough. CBST, I am proud to say, I think a year and a half ago, our task force dedicated to analyzing and studying the issue of sanctuary synagogues brought a proposal to our board of directors which unanimously voted that CBST should become a sanctuary synagogue. We as a synagogue are a sanctuary synagogue, but what does that mean? That's the physical building that we are. We have said that we will provide physical sanctuary on a short-term basis because of the space we have for those friends who need some short-term sanctuary. But that's not the most important thing that we do as a synagogue. First of all, you have to know that every donation you make to the synagogue, that's helping that exist. And what are we doing? We are members of the New Sanctuary Coalition, which is the prominent organization here in New York City doing sanctuary work. But what does that mean, doing sanctuary work? For example, those under detention have to offer bail to be able to get out of detention, even to wait for a hearing. Used to be the bail was $300, $500 per person, which if you're poor, that is completely out of reach. In the last 2 years, that number has increased to $3,000 or $5,000. So if somebody is in detention waiting for a hearing about their immigration status, for sure they'll never be able to get out. CBST now has a bail fund. And of course, it's a revolving core of money that can help people actually post the money, and they only want clergy to post the money to show the courts how seriously the community is taking this. So one of our clergy goes down to the courtroom and posts the bail so one person can get out while they wait for their hearing. And then, of course, the money circulates back in. So don't tell me you don't have time to do something, because if you don't have time, you could make a donation to a bail fund. Secondly, every single Wednesday night, and we are the only synagogue in America who is doing this, thanks to the hard work of our CBST volunteers, many of whom are here today. And I'd like to ask all of our sanctuary folks to stand for a minute so people can see you and know who they can go up to and ask if they want to volunteer. Look at these are our sanctuary team. Thank you. You want to do something about the fact that our country is doing what it's doing to immigrants? These are the folks to talk to. Every Wednesday night, we are offering an immigration legal clinic, a pro se clinic, for Russian speakers from the former Soviet Union who are in fear of persecution for being gay from the former Soviet Union. We've helped a Nigerian who's in fear of persecution from being gay from Nigeria get asylum status. We have many from Central America who are looking for help to fill out forms, to tell their story, to accompany them. You think you need to be a lawyer to do this? You don't. We have lawyers to supervise the legal pieces of it. Do you speak English? Can you fill out a form? Can you help people move through an extremely tedious, painful, and lonely process? We accompany people to their ICE hearings. So think of this. We who are living in America in a bubble, not really being aware of what it's like, when somebody has a hearing, none of their relatives, perhaps, or friends are going to go with them, because walking into the federal building at 26 Federal Plaza is a terrifying thing if your immigration status is at risk. And we now know that ICE is arresting people in the building itself who come with their relatives for a hearing. So no one is with them to just sit in the courtroom, to go with them, to meet them at a Dunkin' Donuts beforehand and walk with them. So there's somebody with them. We can't speak in the courtroom, but just so when they turn around and they see there are friendly faces, and the judges see that there's a community that cares. I promise you, if you do one of these accompaniments, you will not be the same person afterward. You will see an America you had no idea existed. There are many different ways to be involved, but here's the first place to start. In thinking about this year ahead, to understand there are two basic reasons that we Jews care. One is theological. Hagar, the stranger is among us, and it is our theological, it is our God-given obligation to do whatever we can to embrace the stranger and to make them feel at home. When our friends, and that's the language we use, come on Wednesday night into our clinic, they have said to us over and over again in all different kinds of ways that it's the one place during the week where they feel safe, where they feel at home. And many of them come back to become volunteers themselves. Particularly if you speak Spanish or Russian, those are great languages for us to need. But even if you don't, and even if you're not a lawyer, you're welcome to help. But as I said before, we are the only synagogue that are offering not just this legal clinic, but because of the hard work of several of our members, we are now accredited by the New York State Bar to offer a CLE, a continuing legal education in immigration law. For lawyers who have to do a certain amount of continuing education, they can take for free at CBST a unit, or through however many units it is, I'm not a lawyer, so a unit of immigration law to fulfill that requirement. Lee Goldberg, our CBST board member, wrangled that for many, many months with the bureaucracy of New York State. Noemi Maslia, our immigration lawyer, teaches the clinic. And since May, when we started doing this, and we're doing one of these every other month, we've trained how many lawyers? 60 lawyers. We don't make them pay a penny for it, and it's a very, usually, and any lawyers in the room know, a CLE thing can cost a lot of money. We do it for free and ask them to donate 10 hours of their time to our clinic instead. 60 lawyers. We're Jewish, we have a lot of lawyers. That's a lot of help to people who need it. Hagar. Let's look back at the text. In the story, we find that Hagar speaks to God. Now, how odd is that? How many people in the Bible speak directly to God? Not a lot. Hagar is one of the first that we see, certainly one of the only women who are identified, but Hagar speaks directly to God, and God speaks directly to Hagar. That alone tells us where Hagar's presence is in God's eyes. And sorry, I was on the wrong page. So on page 486, so Hagar says, in the English, she says, if you see in the English, so Abraham sends her on the way. She went and wandered in the desert of Beersheba, and the water in the water sack was empty. She left the child in the shadow of a bush, and she went and she sat a bowshot's length away from him. And she started weeping. Let me not look upon the child's death. And she raised her voice and wept. Today's New York Times. Peering over the Rio Grande, separated from Brownsville, Texas, by only 100 feet of coursing water, Ana Valdez talked herself down from a perilous decision. Something she has done several times in the week she's been living in a tent in one of Mexico's most dangerous cities. When I'm this close and I could see it, I'm tempted to think I should just swim across, but for what? Last week, a 26-year-old mother and her toddler drowned crossing the river from Mexico to the United States, the second parent and child to die there since June. Let me not look upon the child's death, Hagar said, and she started to weep. If we think these stories are just ancient ones, they are interwoven with today's news. God heard the child's voice, and the angel called out to Hagar from heaven, "Don't be afraid, for God has heard this child's voice, Ba'asher Husham, where he sits. Arise now, take the boy, and I shall make this boy a great nation." She looked because God opened her eyes and she saw a well. She filled the sack of water, gave water to the boy, and God was with the boy. And this boy grew up, and he became a shooter of the bow. He dwelt in the desert, and he married a wife his mother got for him from Egypt. And we go to the end of this reading on page 489. This is the part of the story that very few people focus on. We go back to Abraham and Avimelech, who was his enemy in some ways. And there the two of them declared at Beersheba, the same place that the child was with the mother. And Avimelech rose, and they returned home. They built the well, and the two of them declared an oath and made a covenant at Beersheba, sworn enemies. They declared an oath. And he called there one name, the Eternal God. And Abraham lived near the country of the Philistine for many days. What is the connection between this story of enemies becoming having a treaty and becoming allies, and the son and the boy? I believe we are the hands of God. God does not come down like a puppeteer and whisking around and rescuing at the last minute necessarily. As I said last night, that's not how God functions in the world. God is waiting for us to act godly. If we act in the ways that God wants of us, then miracles will happen, like the end of this reading where enemies become friends. The Philistine here, the Palestinians, and even Abraham, the Israelis, you might imagine. That when we act in ways that God demands of us, that we hear the cry of the boy, that we see the children dying in the rivers trying to get to these United States, that we hear the cries, and we don't let it just crush us with despair. That is a luxury we have. We must act. The sound of the shofar is the sound that calls us to action. The sound of the shofar, we hear it on Rosh Hashanah in order to wake up from our slumber. The sound of the shofar is there to go inside of you as the voice of crying out. It is the ram that we read about tomorrow that rescues one boy from death and reminds us of our obligation to save the children. There is no excuse. Not a single person in this room is excused. Use your money, use your time, figure out how to wake up and stop being asleep. The shofar demands it of us. And I promise you this, as soon as you start doing something, you actually feel better. As soon as you sit across a table from one of our friends in the Evan Wolfson room of our building and take 3 weeks of meetings to help a friend tell their story, as horrific and horrifying as it is, and that friend hugs you and sees you as a friend here in the United States, you will feel differently. But we must wake up from that slumber of feeling either despair or paralyzed or overwhelmed. I stand before you on this Rosh Hashanah. We, who have the privilege of either being born in this country or having legal status in this country, have no excuses. And for those of you who are immigrants to this country who are in this room, you have made this community so much richer, so much deeper. And we, who are children of immigrants in this room, must remember we honor the memories of those who traveled terrible journeys to get here. When we care about the journey of that young woman on the river in Mexico looking across to the United States, not sure whether they should take their toddler into that river to get here. We don't have to go to the border to do something concrete and make a difference. We must do it here. Again, if you need help figuring out what to do, if that piece of it is overwhelming to you, rabbi@cbst.org, and I will help you find a way that fits to who you are and to what your life looks like. And now we turn to the shofar service, to sounding the shofar for the first time of this Rosh Hashanah. And I ask you to focus on where in your life you are asleep. Where are you crushed down? Where are you paralyzed? Where are you overwhelmed? And let the sound of the shofar wake you up, give you energy, inspire you, and give you hope. Please stand if you are able.